What happens when a moment of anger changes everything? In this story, we follow David, a veteran flight attendant whose bitterness leads him to make a terrible mistake. His impulsive actions toward a young passenger not only threaten his career, but force him to confront the hard truths about his own prejudices and insecurities. As David faces the fallout-strained family relationships, judgment from his peers, and deep personal regret, embarks on a journey toward redemption. Through painful self-reflection and hard-earned lessons, he fights to rebuild his life and prove that real change is possible. Join us for this powerful story of growth, forgiveness, and second chances. If you enjoy stories of redemption and personal transformation, like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more inspiring content. David Reynolds sat in the break room of Skyworld Airlines, staring out of the wide window that overlooked the busy terminal below. Travelers bustled through the airport, dragging suitcases, some on their phones, others lost in conversation, but all seemingly unaware of the man watching from above. The constant hum of the terminal, once comforting, now grated on him, like the low buzz of a fluorescent light about to burn out. David shifted in his chair, his body aching with the stiffness that came from 3 decades of walking down narrow airplane aisles and lifting passengers' bags into overhead bins. His knees creaked with the movement, a reminder that time had caught up with him, even if he didn't want to admit it. He glanced at the clock, an hour until his next flight. He had worked this route New York to Los Angeles more times than he could count. It was a busy, routine flight, filled with business people, tourists, and the occasional celebrity. First class was usually packed with executives demanding service as if they were kings and queens. David's job was to make sure their every need was met, and that used to be enough. But lately, nothing felt the same. The job wasn't what it used to be. Skyworld Airlines had changed, and it wasn't just the company. It was the world. Diversity, inclusion, youth. Those words were everywhere now, plastered on company posters and thrown around in staff meetings. It felt like a constant reminder that the airline no longer valued people like David, people who had worked their whole lives, paying their dues and earning their place. Now, young recruits fresh out of flight school were promoted over him. Promotions seemed to be handed out based on who could fill a quota, not who had the most experience. David sneered at the thought, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. He looked up from his thoughts just as Lisa Carter walked into the break room, her fresh face glowing with enthusiasm. She had recently been promoted to lead flight attendant, a position David had been eyeing for years. Lisa was too young, David thought, and full of the optimism he had long since lost. She was one of the new breeds of flight attendants who seemed to think they could walk in and take what they wanted without earning it. "Morning, David," Lisa said with a bright smile as she grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge. David grunted in response, not bothering to hide his disdain. Lisa didn't seem to notice or care. She was one of those people who just kept going, no matter what. Her attitude irritated him to no end. "You ready for the LA flight?" she asked, opening her bottle and taking a long sip. David forced a tight smile. "I've been doing it long enough. I think I can handle it." Lisa laughed, a light sound that felt like nails on a chalkboard to David. "Of course. You're a pro. Well, see you on board." As she left, David let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples. It wasn't Lisa's fault, not really, but everything about her reminded him of what he was losing, what he had already lost. He used to love his job. There was a time when being a flight attendant was something to be proud of. Passengers were respectful, and the crew felt like family. But now, it felt like he was just going through the motions, overshadowed by younger, more diverse colleagues who didn't seem to care about tradition or experience. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. A message from his daughter, Emily, lit up the screen. "Haven't heard from you in a while, Dad. Are you doing okay?" David's heart clenched. He hadn't spoken to Emily in weeks, maybe longer. Their relationship had always been strained, but lately it felt like she was slipping away entirely. She was in her 20s now, independent, living her own life, and increasingly distant. Part of him knew it was his fault, had always been stubborn, set in his ways, and slow to change. Emily had never fit into the mold he had imagined for her. She was outspoken, passionate about social issues, and fiercely independent, traits he had struggled to understand, let alone appreciate. He stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the screen. He knew he should respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he pocketed his phone and stood up, draining the last of his coffee before heading out of the break room. As he walked through the terminal, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Everything felt louder than it used to, the noise, the chaos. Travelers were more demanding, less patient. The world had changed, and David felt like a relic of a time when things were simpler, more orderly. His mind wandered back to the meeting he had sat through just last week. Sky World's new focus on diversity and inclusion had been the main topic. The company had been pushing it hard, and David had sat in the back of the room, arms crossed, as the HR representative explained the new policies. They talked about creating a more inclusive environment, about promoting people from all walks of life. But all David heard was that his years of service didn't matter anymore. The message was clear: experience was no longer the most important thing. Now it was all about fresh perspectives and diversity, as if people like him, with 3 decades of hard work behind them, no longer had value. David couldn't help but scoff at the thought. As he reached the gate for his flight, David checked his watch. 15 minutes until boarding. He glanced around the waiting area, watching families, business people, and vacationers juggling bags and kids, all waiting to board. A family with 3 young children struggled to keep everything together, the kids whining and pulling at their mother's sleeve as she frantically tried to manage. David rolled his eyes. It wasn't that he hated kids. It was the noise, the chaos. Everything felt too loud, too chaotic these days. Passengers used to sit quietly, follow the rules, and respect the crew. Now it was a free-for-all. Everyone felt entitled to something, entitled to special treatment, to more legroom, to better service. He caught sight of Lisa again, chatting and laughing with 2 other young flight attendants by the coffee stand. They were all so full of energy, like they didn't have a care in the world. They moved with a kind of lightness David hadn't felt in years. It was as if the weight of the job hadn't yet settled on their shoulders, and maybe it never would. David's jaw tightened as he looked away. He had more experience in his pinky finger than those girls had in their entire careers, but none of that seemed to matter anymore. The airline was more interested in hiring fresh faces, people who could relate to passengers, who could project the company's new image of diversity and modernity. And David, well, he was just the old guard. He shook his head, frustrated, as he headed toward the gate to prepare for boarding. His mind wandered to the promotion he had been passed over for recently, a supervisory role he had been eyeing for years. But instead of giving it to him, the company had promoted Lisa. Lisa, with her bright smile and boundless optimism, had waltzed in and taken the position that should have been his. Diversity initiatives, they called it. Inclusion, fresh perspectives. That was the reasoning behind it. David had nearly walked out of the meeting when they announced it. His bitterness had festered since then, growing into something darker, something he didn't like to examine too closely. He reached the gate, scanning the waiting passengers as they gathered their bags and prepared to board. One face in particular caught his eye, a young black girl, no older than 12 or 13, sitting alone, headphones in her ears and a backpack slung over her shoulder. She looked calm, completely at ease, her curly hair bouncing as she glanced out the window. David's stomach tightened with irritation. What was she doing in first class? He had memorized the manifest earlier, and there hadn't been any mention of an unaccompanied minor. Young kids didn't usually fly alone in first class, and for some reason her presence there bothered him. She was too young, too casual, too confident. He approached her seat in first class, his hand resting on the back of one of the seats as he cleared his throat. The girl looked up, her eyes wide and innocent, but there was a calmness about her that set David on edge. "Excuse me, miss," David said, his voice low but authoritative. "Can I see your ticket?" The girl blinked, clearly confused, but reached into her backpack and handed him the boarding pass without question. David scanned the ticket quickly, seat 3A, first class. It was legitimate. She had every right to be there. But something about her didn't sit right with him. "You're in the right seat," David said, handing the ticket back, though his tone carried more suspicion than reassurance. The girl nodded, tucking the ticket away and turning her attention back to the window. David stood there for a moment longer, his irritation rising for reasons he couldn't quite explain. He knew the ticket was valid, but it didn't matter. In his mind, she didn't belong there. As he turned to walk away, a nagging feeling gnawed at him. Something about this girl, her confidence, her ease in a space that wasn't hers, made him feel uncomfortable, and it was a feeling he couldn't shake. David stepped into the galley, trying to shake off the irritation building inside him. He had done this flight 1,000 times, and yet today felt different. It wasn't just the passengers, it was the world around him. Everything was changing, and not in ways that made sense to him. He busied himself, adjusting the meal carts, running his hands over the smooth metal surfaces as a way to ground himself. But his mind kept drifting back to the girl in seat 3A. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Who was she, he wondered? Why was she sitting in first class, alone? It wasn't just her age, though that was part of it. It was the confidence with which she carried herself. She sat there like she belonged, like she had every right to be there. And that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He tried to focus on his pre-flight duties, going through the motions as he'd done for years, checking the overhead compartments, ensuring the seat belts were fastened, and preparing the cabin for takeoff. But no matter what he did, his thoughts kept drifting back to the girl. Each time he passed by her seat, his eyes inevitably lingered on her, as if waiting for her to do something that would justify the unease he felt. The other flight attendants were too busy with their own tasks to notice David's distraction. Anna Henderson, his colleague for the flight, flashed him a bright smile as she arranged the service carts. Anna was always upbeat, always friendly, the type of person who seemed to thrive in this new era of airline service. But today, her positivity grated on David more than usual. "Everything set for takeoff?" Anna asked cheerfully, snapping him out of his thoughts. David nodded, forcing a tight smile. "Yeah, all set." Anna didn't seem to notice his tension. "Good, looks like it'll be a smooth flight. Should be easy." David didn't respond, the knot in his chest tightening. Smooth flight maybe for everyone else, but not for him. He could already feel the weight of his frustration building. As the last of the passengers boarded, the flight attendants took their positions for the pre-flight announcements. David found himself once again standing near first class, just a few rows behind seat 3A. His eyes fell on the girl, still sitting quietly with her headphones in, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside him. The cabin filled with the usual pre-flight murmur, passengers settling into their seats, adjusting their bags and making small talk. But for David, the sound seemed muffled, like he was underwater, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the safety announcements were made, and David mechanically went through the motions, demonstrating how to fasten seatbelts and use oxygen masks. His body was on autopilot, but his mind was elsewhere, consumed by the growing feeling that this girl didn't belong. Once the plane was in the air, David tried to distract himself with his duties, moving methodically through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks with a practiced efficiency. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, his thoughts kept drifting back to seat 3A. The girl hadn't caused any trouble. She hadn't demanded anything or acted out of line. In fact, she hadn't said a word since their brief interaction before takeoff. And yet her presence continued to gnaw at him. David found himself pacing the aisle, his steps heavy as he passed her seat again and again, each time waiting for something, anything that would confirm the feeling he had. But nothing happened. The girl remained quiet, her focus shifting between the window and her book. Finally, David couldn't take it anymore. He had to do something. He had to confront her, to reassert the sense of order that he felt had been disrupted. His mind buzzed with years of resentment, frustration, and anger, all of it now directed at this one girl who had done nothing wrong but exist in a space that, to David, she didn't seem to belong. He approached her seat, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The girl glanced up from her book as he stopped beside her, her expression calm but curious, as if she could sense the tension in his stance. David cleared his throat, his voice low but firm. "Miss, I need to see your ticket again." The girl blinked, clearly confused. "I already showed it to you," she said quietly, her voice polite but unsure. David's jaw tightened. "I want to see it again," he demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Slowly, the girl reached into her bag and pulled out the boarding pass, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it to him. David snatched the ticket from her, scanning it once more, even though he already knew it was valid. Seat 3A, first class. Everything was in order. But despite the clear evidence in front of him, David's frustration only grew. It didn't matter that the ticket was legitimate. In his mind, she still didn't belong. He handed the ticket back to her with a tight-lipped sneer, his voice sharp. "Next time, make sure you're where you're supposed to be." The girl's eyes widened, her face flushing with confusion and hurt, but she didn't argue. She took the ticket, tucking it back into her bag, her hands trembling slightly as she looked down at her book, clearly shaken by the encounter. David stood there for a moment longer, his heart racing, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had done what he set out to do. He had made her uncomfortable, had reasserted his authority. But instead of feeling satisfied, he felt empty. As he turned and walked away, a strange sense of guilt gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. He wasn't ready to face that feeling, not yet. The tension in the cabin grew palpable after David's second confrontation with the girl. The murmurs of the passengers around them had shifted from idle chatter to low whispers of confusion and concern. People had noticed the way David had singled out the girl, and the energy in the cabin had changed. Back in the galley, David paced, his thoughts racing. He could feel the weight of what he had done pressing down on him, but he was too angry to stop and think it through. Something inside him felt wrong off, but his frustration was still bubbling over, clouding his judgment. Anna, noticing his agitation, approached him cautiously. "David, what's going on?" she asked, her voice gentle but filled with concern. David avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the meal trays in front of him. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered, though the words felt hollow even to him. Anna frowned, her brows furrowing as she glanced toward the first-class cabin where the girl sat, now visibly uncomfortable. "It seems like something more than that," she said quietly. "That girl, she's just sitting there. She hasn't done anything wrong." David clenched his jaw, his frustration boiling over. "You wouldn't understand," he snapped, turning away from her. Anna flinched at his tone, her concern deepening. She had worked with David for years and had never seen him act like this. Normally, he was strict but professional, a no-nonsense kind of guy. But today, there was an edge to him that made her uneasy. "David," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm, "you're making a scene. People are noticing." Her words cut through the fog of David's anger, and for the first time, he realized just how many passengers had been watching him. He had seen their eyes flicking between him and the girl, had felt their stares burning into his back. And now, as he stood in the galley, he knew that he had crossed a line. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, but instead of acknowledging it, David pushed it away, his anger flaring once more. He wasn't ready to admit he had been wrong, not yet. Instead, he focused on the girl, on the way she had looked at him, her wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. He had made her feel small, powerless, and for a brief moment, that had made him feel in control again. But now, standing in the galley with Anna's concerned gaze on him, David felt a strange mixture of guilt and anger swirling inside him. He didn't know how to reconcile those emotions, so he did what he always did, pushed them down, locking them away where he wouldn't have to deal with them. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice clipped. "Just let me handle it." Anna hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. She knew David well enough to know when to back off, but this felt different. This felt wrong. Finally, she gave a small nod, stepping back. "Just be careful. Okay, people are watching." David didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed the tray of drinks and stormed back into the cabin, his eyes once again locking onto the girl in seat 3A. David moved down the aisle, handing out drinks with a practiced efficiency, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Every time he glanced at the girl, his frustration flared anew. She sat there, quietly reading her book, her body stiff and tense, as if bracing for another confrontation. When he reached her seat, he paused, standing over her for a moment before speaking. "Would you like something to drink?" he asked, his voice sharper than usual. The girl glanced up, her brow furrowing slightly as she sensed the tension in his tone. "No, thank you," she said softly, returning her focus to her book. David stood there for a moment longer, his hand tightening around the tray as his frustration bubbled over. "You sure?" he pressed, his voice coming out harsher than intended. The girl blinked, clearly confused by his insistence. "I'm fine," she said again, a little louder this time, though her voice still held a nervous quiver. David turned on his heel and stalked back to the galley, slamming the tray down on the counter with enough force to make the glasses rattle. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing shallow as his anger reached its peak. He didn't know why this girl was getting under his skin so much, but the more he thought about it, the more he convinced himself that she didn't belong there. It wasn't about the ticket, it was about her. Her presence in first class felt like an affront, a challenge to everything David had come to believe about the world and his place in it. David stood alone in the galley, his fists clenched as he fought to regain control of his breathing. The reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in, and with it came a wave of guilt that threatened to overwhelm him. He had gone too far, crossed a line he knew he couldn't uncross. He wasn't just enforcing rules anymore, he was acting on something much darker, something he had been pushing down for years. He knew it wasn't about the girl in seat 3A. Not really. It was about everything that had built up inside him over the years, the bitterness, the frustration, the feeling that the world was moving forward without him. He had let all of that spill out onto an innocent girl, and now he was left standing in the aftermath of his own actions, unsure of how to make things right. Anna appeared in the galley, her expression filled with concern. "David," she said quietly, "I think you need to take a break." David shook his head, still too caught up in his emotions to acknowledge the truth. "I'm fine," he muttered, though he knew it wasn't true. Anna sighed, her frustration evident. "This isn't like you. I don't know what's going on, but you need to step back. You're making everyone uncomfortable." David's stomach twisted with guilt. He could see it in her eyes. Anna was worried about him, but she was also frustrated. He had put her in a difficult position, and she didn't deserve that. None of this was fair to her or anyone else on the crew. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice tight. "I just need a minute." Anna didn't push further, but her silence spoke volumes. She turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving David alone with his thoughts. For a long moment, David stood there, staring blankly at the wall in front of him. His mind raced, replaying the scene over and over again. The way he had spoken to the girl, the look of fear and confusion in her eyes, it all came rushing back to him with a clarity that made his chest tighten. What had he done? He had let his frustration, his bitterness, control him. He had made a child feel small, powerless, and unwelcome, all because of his own insecurities. And now he had no idea how to fix it. The intercom crackled to life, announcing that the plane would begin its descent soon. David's heart sank. He knew that once they landed, there would be no escaping the consequences of his actions. The plane landed smoothly at LAX, but the atmosphere in the cabin was anything but calm. David could feel the tension hanging in the air, thick and oppressive. As the passengers began to disembark, many of them threw sideways glances his way, their eyes filled with judgment and confusion. He stood at the exit, forcing a tight smile as he thanked each passenger for flying with them, but inside, he was spiraling. Every thank you felt hollow, every glance a reminder of what had happened. When the girl from seat 3A appeared in the aisle, her small frame looking even smaller now, David's heart clenched. She walked slowly, her eyes cast downward, avoiding his gaze as she clutched her backpack tightly to her chest. For a brief moment her eyes flicked up, meeting his, and the sadness in them hit David like a punch to the gut. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if she heard him. She said nothing as she passed, disappearing down the jet bridge with the other passengers. David stood there, frozen, watching her go, the weight of his actions pressing down on him harder than ever. As the last of the passengers left, David remained at the door, staring out into the empty terminal. His mind raced with the possibilities of what might happen next. He knew there would be reports, complaints from passengers who had witnessed the incident. He had seen the phones come out, recording him as he questioned the girl again and again. He knew the airline would hear about it. And in today's world, where everything was captured and shared online, it wouldn't be long before this incident became something much bigger. Anna approached him cautiously, her voice soft. "You okay?" David shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. "I'm sorry," he muttered again, though this time it was meant for more than just the girl. It was meant for Anna, for the crew, for everyone who had been caught in the crossfire of his anger and frustration. Anna gave him a small, understanding nod, though her eyes were filled with concern. "It's not too late, you know," she said gently, "but you need to talk to someone. You can't keep this bottled up." David nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed her. It felt too late. The damage was done, and now all he could do was wait for the consequences to catch up with him. The next morning, David received the call he had been dreading. "David, this is Cameron Davis from Skyworld HR." The voice on the other end of the line said, calm but firm. "We've received several complaints from passengers about your conduct on yesterday's flight. We need to meet with you today to discuss the situation." David's heart sank. He had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken out loud made it real in a way that sent a chill down his spine. "Of course," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The meeting at the airline's headquarters was as uncomfortable as David had expected. Cameron, along with his direct supervisor, Megan Johnston, sat across from him in a small, sterile conference room, their expressions serious but professional. "We've reviewed the reports from the passengers, as well as some video footage that was shared online," Megan began, her voice measured. "It's clear that your interaction with the young passenger in first class was inappropriate." David nodded, his throat tight. He couldn't argue with that. He had let his emotions get the better of him, and now he was paying the price. "Given the severity of the complaints," Cameron continued, "we've made the decision to place you on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a full investigation." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. Administrative leave. He had been with Skyworld for over 30 years, and now, in the blink of an eye, everything he had worked for was at risk. "I understand," David said quietly, his voice barely audible. Cameron's expression softened slightly. "David, we know you've been with the company a long time, and we respect the work you've done. But this situation is serious. We have to take the complaints seriously." David nodded again, unable to meet their eyes. He knew they were right. He had crossed a line, and now he had to face the consequences. "We'll be in touch once the investigation is complete," Megan said, her voice kind but firm. "In the meantime, I suggest you take some time to reflect on what happened." Reflect. The word echoed in David's mind as he left the conference room, his body feeling heavy with the weight of his guilt. What had he become? How had he let things spiral so far out of control? For the first few days of his leave, David wandered through his apartment like a ghost, unable to shake the overwhelming sense of failure that clung to him. He tried to distract himself with chores, with television, with anything that might take his mind off what had happened, but nothing worked. The image of the girl's face, the way her eyes had filled with confusion and hurt, haunted him. He had always prided himself on being a good flight attendant. He followed the rules, kept things orderly, and made sure everyone on his flights was taken care of. But somewhere along the way, that pride had turned into something else, something darker. He had spent so many years feeling overlooked, passed over for promotions, watching younger, more diverse colleagues rise through the ranks while he stayed stagnant. It had built up inside him, that bitterness, until it had consumed him. And now he was left to pick up the pieces of the damage it had caused. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, the screen lighting up with a text from his daughter, Emily. "Hey, Dad! Saw the video. Are you okay?" David's stomach twisted with shame. Of course she had seen it. Everyone had seen it by now. The video had been shared online, spreading across social media like wildfire. His actions were out there for the world to see, and there was no taking them back. He stared at the screen for a long time, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He knew he should respond, should tell her the truth, that he wasn't okay, that he had messed up in ways he couldn't even begin to explain. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he set the phone down and stared out the window, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a physical force. A few days later, David received an unexpected knock on his door. When he opened it, he found his ex-wife, Linda, standing there, her expression a mixture of concern and sympathy. "David," she said softly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I heard about what happened." David sighed, rubbing his temples as he closed the door behind her. "Let me guess. Emily told you." Linda nodded, her eyes softening. "She's worried about you." David sank onto the couch, feeling the weight of the past few days settle over him like a heavy blanket. "I messed up, Linda," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to fix it." Linda sat down beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "You can't fix it, David. Not all of it, anyway. But you can take responsibility. You can learn from it." David looked down at his hands, the guilt gnawing at him. "I don't know if I can." Linda's voice was firm but kind. "You don't have a choice. You've been carrying this bitterness for a long time, and it's finally caught up with you. But it doesn't have to define you." David swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "I don't even know where to start." Linda squeezed his shoulder gently. "Start by apologizing. To the girl, to yourself, to anyone you've hurt along the way. And then figure out how to let go of all that anger." "It's not doing you any good?" David nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed it yet. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't keep living like this. He had to change, or he would lose everything. The next morning, David sat at his kitchen table, a pen in hand and a blank piece of paper in front of him. He didn't know if the girl or her family would ever read the letter he was about to write, but he knew he had to try. After what felt like hours, he finally put pen to paper. "Dear Miss Taylor, I'm writing to apologize for my actions on Flight 762 from New York to Los Angeles. My behavior was inexcusable, and I deeply regret how I treated you. I made assumptions about you that were unfair and hurtful, and for that, I am truly sorry. You didn't deserve to be singled out or questioned the way you were, and I recognize now that my actions were driven by my own biases and frustrations. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on what happened, and I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better. I know that words alone can't undo the harm I've caused, but I hope that in time you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Sincerely, David Reynolds." As he sealed the envelope and placed it on the counter, David felt a strange mixture of anxiety and relief. He wasn't sure if the letter would make a difference, but it was a start. He had taken the first step, and now all he could do was continue moving forward. The days that followed were filled with quiet reflection. David knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. David sat in his small kitchen the next morning, sipping on a cup of coffee, staring at the sealed envelope he had written the night before. The apology letter felt like both a burden and a relief. He knew that sending it wouldn't erase what had happened, but it was the first real step he had taken toward making amends. He wasn't sure if Miss Taylor or her family would ever respond, and part of him doubted they would. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the point. The point was that he had acknowledged his mistake, his prejudice, and was taking responsibility for it. For the first time in days, David felt a glimmer of hope. It was faint and fragile, but it was there. His phone buzzed on the counter, and for a moment he hesitated before picking it up. He had been avoiding social media and news outlets ever since the incident. The world seemed to thrive on sensationalizing situations like this, and he didn't have the stomach to read the angry comments or watch the videos of himself that had undoubtedly gone viral. But this wasn't a news notification or a social media update. It was a message from Emily. "Emily, hey Dad, been thinking about you. How are you holding up?" David stared at the screen for a long moment before responding. It had been weeks since they had really talked, and he knew he had a lot of ground to cover with her, a lot of apologies to make. But for now, he started small. David, am trying to be better, Made some mistakes, but am working on it. He hit send, feeling the familiar weight of guilt settle over him. There was so much more he wanted to say, so much he needed to explain, but he didn't know how to begin. How do you admit to your own child that you failed, not just as a father, but as a person? A few days later, David received an email from Skyworld's HR department. The investigation was still ongoing, but they had scheduled a follow-up meeting to discuss the next steps. David's heart sank as he read the message, knowing that this meeting would likely determine his future with the airline. He had been with Skyworld for over 30 years, and the thought of losing his job was terrifying. But more than that, he knew that whatever came next, he would have to face the full consequences of his actions. On the day of the meeting, David dressed in his best suit and tie, trying to look presentable despite the anxiety gnawing at him. He arrived at Skyworld's headquarters early, his stomach twisted in knots as he waited in the lobby. When Megan, his supervisor, finally called him into the conference room, David took a deep breath and followed her inside. Cameron Davis, the HR representative, was already seated at the table, his expression neutral but professional. "David," Megan began, her voice calm, "thank you for coming in. We've reviewed the complaints and the video footage, and we've spoken with several passengers who were on the flight." David nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "The situation is serious," Cameron added. "The video has received a lot of attention online, and we've been under pressure to respond appropriately. The airline has a reputation to maintain, and we can't afford to overlook incidents like this." David swallowed hard, bracing himself for the worst. "We've decided," Megan continued, "to place you on extended unpaid leave for the remainder of the investigation. During this time, we will require you to undergo sensitivity and diversity training, as well as counseling to help you process some of the issues that may have contributed to this incident." The words hit David like a ton of bricks. Extended unpaid leave. Sensitivity training. He had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken out loud still stung. But as the weight of the consequences settled over him, David also felt a strange sense of relief. This wasn't a firing, he still had a chance to make things right, to prove that he could change. "I understand," David said quietly. "He'll do whatever it takes." Megan nodded, her expression softening slightly. "David, we've worked together a long time, and I know you're not a bad person. But this incident has shown us that there's a deeper issue here, and we need to address it. This is your chance to reflect, to grow, and to come back better." Cameron chimed in, his tone more businesslike but still firm. "The airline is committed to diversity and inclusion, and that means everyone on staff needs to be aligned with those values. We believe you can learn from this, but it's going to take effort." David nodded again, the weight of their words settling over him. This was his opportunity to turn things around, and he wasn't going to waste it. David's first day of diversity and sensitivity training was difficult, to say the least. The training was held in a small conference room in a quiet part of the city, and as David entered the room, he felt a mixture of dread and discomfort. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it would be uncomfortable. This wasn't going to be just a checklist of tasks to complete, it was going to require him to look inward, to confront the very things he had been avoiding for years. The facilitator, Sophia, greeted the group with a warm but serious expression. "This isn't just about checking a box," she began. "This is about understanding the ways we've been conditioned to see the world and how those views can hurt others. It's about learning to unlearn certain behaviors and attitudes that don't serve us or the people around us." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair as the session began. The topics ranged from implicit bias to microaggressions to the history of systemic racism. Each discussion forced David to think about his own life, his upbringing, and the way he had internalized certain prejudices without even realizing it. One particular exercise hit David hard. It was called the perspective shift, where participants were asked to step into the shoes of someone who had experienced discrimination or prejudice. David was given the role of a young black man trying to apply for a loan, only to be met with suspicion and doubt despite having a strong financial background. As David played through the scenario, he felt a sharp pang of frustration, a sliver of the kind of exhaustion and anger that came from being constantly questioned, constantly having to prove your worth in a world that judged you before you even opened your mouth. When the exercise ended, David sat in silence, staring at the piece of paper in front of him. For the first time, he was beginning to understand. Not fully, he knew it would take time, but the door had been cracked open, and there was no going back. Sophia approached him during a break, her expression gentle but firm. "I've noticed you've been pretty quiet during the discussions," she said. "How are you feeling about all this?" David sighed, rubbing his hands together as he tried to find the right words. "It's hard," he admitted. "I've spent a long time thinking I knew how the world worked, but now I'm realizing I've been wrong about a lot of things." Sophia nodded, her gaze softening. "That's the first step. It's not easy to admit when we've been wrong, especially when those beliefs are so deeply ingrained. But the fact that you're here, that you're willing to confront it, that's important." David appreciated her words, but the guilt still gnawed at him. "I don't know if I can fix it," he said quietly. "I hurt someone. I can't take that back." Sophia placed a hand on his arm, her voice gentle. "No, you can't take it back. But you can move forward. You can learn from this and do better in the future. That's what matters." Over the following weeks, the diversity training continued, and David found himself opening up more in the group discussions.
He listened to others share their stories of discrimination and prejudice, and each story added another layer to his understanding.
It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about understanding how his actions, even the ones he hadn't meant to cause harm, could contribute to the pain others experienced. One of the sessions focused on privilege specifically, how certain people benefited from unearned advantages simply because of their race, gender, or background. David had always bristled at the idea of privilege. He had worked hard his entire life, faced his own struggles, and overcome plenty of obstacles. But as the session unfolded, David began to see that privilege didn't mean his life had been easy. It meant that certain barriers that others faced had never been there for him. He thought about the girl on the plane, how he had judged her without knowing anything about her, how he had assumed she didn't belong simply because of the way she looked. He had never had to prove his worth simply by existing in a space. But she had, and he had made her feel like she didn't belong. It was a hard realization to swallow, but it was necessary. Toward the end of the training program, David participated in an exercise called the ripple effect. Each participant was asked to reflect on a time when their actions had affected someone else, whether positively or negatively, and to trace the impact of those actions. David immediately thought of the girl in seat 3A, the way his words and actions had made her feel small, unwelcome, and afraid. As he wrote down his thoughts, something shifted inside him. He had spent so long avoiding the full weight of what he had done, but now, in this moment of reflection, he was finally facing it head-on. He had hurt someone in a way that went beyond simple rudeness or frustration. He had made her feel like she didn't belong, and that was something he could never take back. But he could own it. He could acknowledge the harm he had caused and do everything in his power to make sure it never happened again. As the training program came to an end, David felt a sense of closure, but he also knew that the work was far from over. The training had given him the tools to confront his biases and his actions, but it was up to him to continue applying those lessons in his everyday life. One day, after a particularly challenging session, David found himself thinking about the letter he had sent to Miss Taylor's family. He hadn't received a response, and part of him had expected that. But as he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the sunset filtering through the window, he realized that it wasn't about whether they responded. It was about the act of taking responsibility, of doing what he could to make amends. And so, he sat down at his desk and began writing again, this time to Emily. He owed her an explanation, an apology, and a promise that he was working to be better. He couldn't undo the past, but he could start making things right. David sat at his desk, the blank sheet of paper staring back at him. The letter he had written to Miss Taylor had been difficult, but writing to his daughter, Emily, felt even more daunting. She had always looked up to him, always believed in him, and now he had to tell her how far he had fallen. He had to explain that he wasn't the man she thought he was, that he had made a mistake that went beyond simple frustration. As he picked up the pen, his hand trembled slightly. He took a deep breath and began to write. Dear Emily, I'm not sure how to start this letter, but I know I need to say a lot of things I've been avoiding. I've been thinking a lot about what happened on that flight, what you saw in the video, and I want to be honest with you about everything. I made a mistake, Em. A big one. I let my anger, my frustration, and my bitterness take control. And I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. You've probably seen the comments online, the things people are saying about me, and the truth is, they're not wrong. What I did was wrong, and I can't change that. But I'm trying to make it right. I've been going through diversity and sensitivity training, and it's been a real wake-up call for me. I'm learning things about myself, things I never wanted to admit. It's hard to face, but it's necessary. I've spent so long thinking I knew what was right, that I knew how the world worked. But I was wrong. I see that now. I don't expect you to understand or to forgive me right away. I know I've let you down, and I'm sorry for that. But I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm working on being better, not just for myself, but for the people around me. And for you. You deserve a father who can look at the world with an open mind and a kind heart. And I'm going to do my best to be that person. I love you, Em. Always. Love. Dad. David set the pen down and stared at the letter for a long time. It was perfect, but it was honest. He hoped it was enough to begin rebuilding the bridge he had burned with his daughter. A week later, David received a phone call from Emily. It was late in the evening, and he had been sitting in front of the television, his mind wandering as the sound of the program faded into the background. When his phone buzzed, he nearly jumped, startled by the interruption. "Hey, Dad?" Emily's voice was soft, cautious. David's heart raced as he answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Hi, sweetheart. It's good to hear from you." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and David could almost hear her thinking, trying to figure out what to say next. "I got your letter," Emily said finally. "I've been thinking about it." David closed his eyes, bracing himself for whatever she might say next. He knew she had every right to be angry with him, to feel disappointed. He had always tried to be the strong, reliable father she could depend on, but now she had seen him at his worst. "I don't know how to feel about it, honestly," Emily admitted. "It's weird seeing you like that, Dad. I've always thought of you as I don't know, like a rock. And now it's like you're just human." David's throat tightened at her words. She wasn't angry, not exactly, but she was struggling to reconcile the image she had of him with the reality of who he had become. "I know I messed up, Em," David said quietly. "I've spent so much time trying to be perfect, trying to do everything right, but I wasn't seeing things clearly. I wasn't seeing people clearly." Emily sighed on the other end of the line. "I get that, but it's hard, Dad. I don't want to think of you as someone who could, I don't know, be mean like that." David's heart ached at the thought of how much he had hurt his daughter. "I don't want you to think of me that way either," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that's not who I am anymore." There was another long pause before Emily finally spoke again, her voice a little softer. "I know you're trying, and that's what matters. I need some time, okay?" David nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." "Thanks, Dad," Emily said quietly. "I love you." "I love you too, Em. Always." As they ended the call, David felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. Emily was giving him a chance, and that was more than he could have hoped for. In the weeks that followed, David continued to attend his diversity training and counseling sessions. The training had been an eye-opening experience, but the counseling forced him to confront the deeper, more personal aspects of his behavior. His counselor, Dr. Lisa Grant, was patient but direct, encouraging David to dig into the root causes of his anger and frustration. "It sounds like you've been carrying a lot of resentment for a long time, Doctor," Grant said during one session, her voice calm but firm. "Where do you think that comes from?" David hesitated, running his hand through his thinning hair as he considered her question. I guess I've always felt like I was getting left behind. I've been with the airline for over 30 years, but it feels like everything around me keeps changing. The people, the rules, the way things are done, and I didn't adapt. I let it get to me. Doctor, Grant nodded thoughtfully. It sounds like you've been resisting change, but the world kept moving forward anyway. That can be a hard pill to swallow. David leaned back in his chair, letting her words sink in. She was right, he had resisted change for so long, clinging to the way things used to be. And when the world didn't bend to his will, he had lashed out, taking his frustrations out on others. You can't control the world around you, Doctor, Grant continued. But you can control how you respond to it. It's okay to feel frustrated, but it's important to recognize when those feelings are driving you to act in ways that don't align with your values. David nodded slowly, her words resonating deeply. He had spent so much time feeling powerless, like the world was slipping away from him. But now he was beginning to see that he had the power to change his own perspective, to take responsibility for his actions and grow from them. After several weeks of training, counseling, and reflection, David received a call from Skyworld's HR department. The investigation had concluded, and they were ready to discuss his return to work. When David arrived at Skyworld's headquarters for the meeting, he felt a mix of anxiety and determination. He had done the work, he had confronted his biases, taken responsibility for his actions, and committed to being better. But now, it was time to see if the airline believed in his ability to change. Megan and Cameron greeted him with professional but kind expressions as he sat down in the same conference room where he had faced the beginning of this journey. David, Megan began, her tone measured, we've reviewed your progress, and we've received positive feedback from your training and counseling sessions. It's clear that you've taken this seriously, and we believe you're ready to return to work. David felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he remained composed, knowing that there was more to come. However, Cameron added, we want to be clear that this is a probationary return. We'll be monitoring your performance closely, and we expect you to continue your commitment to the airline's values of diversity, inclusion, and respect. David nodded, fully prepared to meet those expectations. I understand, he said, his voice steady. I'm ready to do better. Megan offered him a small, encouraging smile. We believe you, David. You've put in the work, and we're confident that you can move forward from this. As the meeting ended and David left the headquarters, he felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from everything being perfected. It was the peace that came from knowing he had faced his mistakes head-on and was actively working to be a better person. David's first day back on the job was filled with nerves and anticipation. The familiar sights and sounds of the airport surrounded him as he made his way to the crew check-in desk. But everything felt different now. He had changed. He wasn't the same person who had let bitterness and frustration control him. As he approached the crew area, he saw Anna waiting for him. She gave him a warm smile, her eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and encouragement. Welcome back, she said, pulling him into a quick hug. David smiled, feeling grateful for her support. Thanks, Anna. I'm ready. The rest of the crew greeted him with polite nods and smiles, though David could sense a certain level of caution in their interactions. He knew that trust would take time to rebuild, and he was okay with that. He didn't expect things to go back to the way they were overnight. As they boarded the plane and began preparing for the flight, David felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had missed this, the rhythm of the job, the routine of helping passengers, the satisfaction of making sure everything ran smoothly. But now he saw his role differently. It wasn't just about enforcing rules and keeping order, it was about treating every passenger with respect and kindness, no matter who they were. As the passengers boarded the plane, David greeted each one with a genuine smile, making eye contact and offering help when needed. He noticed a young girl with curly hair, about the same age as Miss Taylor, walking down the aisle with her mother. For a moment, the memory of that fateful flight flashed in his mind, but this time, David didn't feel the same rush of guilt and shame. He had learned from that experience, and now he was determined to do better. Let me help you with that, David said, as the girl's mother struggled to lift their suitcase into the overhead bin. The mother smiled gratefully as David easily placed the suitcase in the bin. The girl looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. "Thank you," the mother said, settling into her seat. David smiled back. "You're welcome. Enjoy your flight." As he continued down the aisle, helping other passengers and ensuring everything was in order, David felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond the routine of his job. He wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. He was someone who had faced his own flaws and had come out the other side stronger, more compassionate, and more aware of the impact his actions had on others. David's first few weeks back at work went by in a blur of quiet determination. Each flight, each interaction with passengers was a step forward, an opportunity to rebuild the trust he had lost and to demonstrate that he had truly changed. He knew he was under a microscope, both by his colleagues and by himself. Every smile he gave, every act of kindness, felt intentional and deliberate. And while it was exhausting at times, David was committed to seeing it through. He had come so far, but he knew that the road to full redemption was long. He had caused harm, and no number of apologies or training could fully undo the damage. But he was learning to accept that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about owning it and moving forward in a way that made him a better person. A few months into his return, David received a call from Emily. They had been talking more frequently since the letter he had written to her, but this call felt different. There was a lightness in her voice that he hadn't heard in a long time. "Dad, I'm coming to visit next weekend," Emily said, excitement bubbling through the phone. David's heart skipped a beat. They had spoken often, but seeing her in person would be different. There were still things left unsaid between them, still an unspoken tension that lingered from the fallout of his actions. "That's great, Em," David replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I can't wait to see you." The week leading up to her visit was a whirlwind of emotions for David. He had been working on himself, but he couldn't shake the fear that Emily might still see him as the man who had let her down, the man who had failed to live up to her expectations. He needed her to see that he was trying to be better, but he also knew that he couldn't rush her forgiveness. When Emily arrived at his apartment that Saturday, David felt a lump form in his throat as he opened the door. She looked just like she had the last time they'd seen each other, but something about her seemed different. Maybe it was the way she smiled at him, the way her eyes held a little more warmth than before. "Hey, Dad," she said softly, stepping inside. David smiled, pulling her into a hug. "Hey, sweetheart, it's so good to see you." They spent the afternoon catching up, talking about her life, her job, and everything that had happened since their last in-person visit. But underneath the surface, David could feel the weight of the conversation they weren't having, the one about his mistakes, about the incident that had shaken their relationship. It wasn't until they were sitting on the couch later that evening, the soft glow of the sunset filtering through the window, that Emily finally brought it up. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, Dad," Emily said, her voice quiet but steady. "And I want you to know that I don't hate you for it. I don't even really blame you. It was hard to see you like that." David nodded, his heart heavy with guilt. "I know, Em. I'm so sorry you had to see that side of me." "I know you're sorry," she replied, "and I can see that you're trying to be better. I'm proud of you for that." David swallowed hard, the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I'm trying, Em. I really am." Emily smiled softly, reaching over to take his hand. "I know, Dad, and I'm proud of you for it. But I think the hardest part for me was realizing that you're human, just like everyone else. You make mistakes, and that's okay. What matters is that you're learning from them." David squeezed her hand, feeling a rush of relief. "I don't want to let you down again," he admitted. "You won't," Emily said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "Because you're doing the work. You're facing it head-on, and that's what matters." They sat in comfortable silence for a while after that, the weight of the conversation slowly lifting. David knew that there would still be moments of doubt, moments where he wondered if he was truly doing enough to make amends. But hearing Emily say she was proud of him gave him the strength to keep going. One afternoon, David found himself on a routine flight from Chicago to New York. The passengers had begun boarding, and as he stood by the aisle assisting with luggage, he noticed a familiar face stepping onto the plane. It was Miss Taylor, the young girl from the flight that had changed everything. David's heart raced as he recognized her. She was walking down the aisle with her mother again, and while she had grown since that fateful flight, there was no mistaking her wide eyes and the quiet confidence with which she carried herself. The memories of that day came flooding back to David, and he felt a sharp pang of guilt all over again. He hadn't expected to ever see her again, and now, here she was, right in front of him. For a moment, David considered saying nothing, just going through the motions of the flight, pretending he hadn't recognized her. But he knew he couldn't do that. He had promised himself that he would face his mistakes, and this was his chance to show her that he had changed. As Miss Taylor and her mother reached their seats, David took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice steady but nervous. "I think we've met before." Miss Taylor looked up at him, her expression curious. Her mother's eyes widened in recognition, but she said nothing. David swallowed hard. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. I don't know if you remember, but I was on a flight with you a while back, and I didn't treat you the way I should have. I've thought about it a lot since then, and I just wanted to apologize." Miss Taylor's mother glanced at her daughter, then back at David, her expression softening slightly. "We remember," she said quietly, "and we appreciate your apology." David nodded, his heart pounding. "I've been working to be better, to make sure that what happened never happens again. I hope you can forgive me." Miss Taylor looked up at him, her eyes thoughtful. She didn't say anything for a moment, and David braced himself for the possibility that she might not forgive him. But then she smiled a small, shy smile, but a smile nonetheless. "It's okay," she said softly. "Thank you." David felt a wave of relief wash over him, and he nodded gratefully. "Thank you," he whispered. As he stepped back, allowing them to settle into their seats, David felt something shift inside him. This moment, their quiet acceptance of his apology, wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a major turning point. He had faced the person he had wronged, and she had shown him grace. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making peace with it. Months passed, and David's life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. His probationary period at Skyworld had ended, and he was officially reinstated as a full-time flight attendant. The tension between him and his colleagues had eased, and he found himself forming deeper connections with some of the newer crew members, people who had once felt like strangers but now felt like friends. Emily visited more often, and their relationship had begun to heal in ways David hadn't thought possible. They talked openly now about everything from work to life to the challenges they faced. There was an honesty between them that hadn't been there before, and while it hadn't been easy to earn back her trust, David knew that they were on the right path. One evening, after a long day of flights, David sat in his apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. He thought about the man he had been, the man who had let bitterness and frustration cloud his judgment, and the man he was becoming. The journey hadn't been easy, but David had learned that real change never was. It required hard work, painful self-reflection, and the willingness to face the parts of yourself that you didn't want to see. As the sun set outside his window, casting a warm golden light over the room, David felt a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't perfect, and he knew he never would be. But he was learning, he was growing, and most importantly, he was trying. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Months later, David found himself in a familiar setting, the airport, preparing for another flight. But this time, everything felt different. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He wasn't clinging to the past or letting his frustrations dictate his actions. He was present, he was mindful, and he was ready for whatever came next. As he walked through the terminal heading toward his gate, David saw a group of young flight attendants chatting by the coffee stand. He smiled to himself, remembering how their laughter and enthusiasm used to irritate him. But now he saw them differently. They weren't threats to his career or reminders of his own insecurities. They were just people doing their jobs, living their lives. David felt a sense of calm wash over him as he boarded the plane and took his position in the aisle, ready to greet the passengers. The flight went smoothly, and as the plane ascended into the sky, David looked out the window, watching the clouds drift by. He wasn't the same man he had been a year ago. He had made mistakes, and he had hurt people along the way. But he had also learned, grown, and found a way to move forward. And as the plane soared through the clouds, David felt a quiet sense of contentment. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was ready for it. Thank you for following along on David's journey of self-reflection and redemption. If this story resonated with you and you'd like to see more powerful stories about personal growth and second chances, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and remember, everyone can change if they're willing to put in the work. Subscribe now for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us that it's never too late to become the best version of ourselves. As he looked out the window at the bustling city below, Ethan felt a sense of excitement for the future. Armstrong Industries was thriving again, and the possibilities were endless. There would be challenges ahead. There always were. But with the right team, the right vision, and the right leadership, anything was possible. Ethan smiled to himself, ready for whatever came next. A month had passed since Ryan's departure, and Armstrong Industries was beginning to flourish in ways that no one could have anticipated. The office that had once been a place of tension, fear, and manipulation was now filled with collaboration, creativity, and energy. It wasn't just the policies Ethan had implemented, it was the change in attitude, the shift in the very fabric of the company's culture. Ethan had taken his role as a leader seriously from the moment he arrived, but now it felt different. He wasn't just an observer or an undercover investigator anymore. He was a part of the team, and the team was thriving. And yet there was still so much to do. One sunny Friday afternoon, the company gathered in the newly renovated lounge for a casual end-of-week wrap-up session. It was something that had become a tradition since Ethan stepped in a moment for the team to come together, share ideas, and celebrate small victories. The air was filled with laughter and the clink of coffee mugs as people chatted freely, something that had been rare just months ago. Ethan stood by the window looking out at the city skyline. He sipped his coffee, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. It was hard to believe how far they had come. Armstrong Industries was no longer just a job for people. It was becoming a place where they could grow, where they could push their creative boundaries, and where they felt valued. That was his vision from the start, and seeing it unfold before his eyes was deeply fulfilling. As he watched his team interact, Ethan spotted Matt Davis chatting animatedly with a few of the newer hires. Matt, once the target of Ryan's humiliation, had become one of the company's rising stars. His confidence had blossomed, and his ideas had helped push Armstrong's marketing strategies to new heights. Kelsey was nearby, talking with a few of the department heads, her usual calm demeanor now punctuated with laughter as she discussed the upcoming project timelines. She had fully embraced her new leadership role, and her ability to inspire and mentor the team was becoming legendary. Jessica approached Ethan, standing beside him as they watched the scene unfold. "I think we can officially say Armstrong has turned a corner," she said with a satisfied smile. Ethan chuckled softly, nodding in agreement. "It's been a journey, that's for sure. But I think we've built something real here, something that'll last." Jessica took a sip of her coffee, her expression thoughtful. "You know, when you first came in, I wasn't sure what to expect. I thought you'd be like every other manager, come in, make some noise, and then fade into the background. But you've actually made this place better. You care about these people." Ethan looked at her, his expression sincere. "I do care, because I've been where they've been. I know what it's like to feel powerless, to feel like you don't have a voice. I never want anyone here to feel that way again." Jessica smiled, her eyes softening. "Well, you've done more than just give them a voice. You've given them hope, and that's not something they're going to forget." Ethan's chest tightened with emotion, but he kept his expression composed. "Thanks, Jessica. That means a lot." They stood in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the team interact, before Jessica spoke again. "So, what's next for you, Ethan?" Now that things are settling down here, are you thinking about the future? Ethan leaned against the window ledge, considering her question. The truth was, he hadn't really thought much about his own future since taking on the role at Armstrong. He had been so focused on fixing the present that he hadn't had time to look beyond it. I guess I'm still figuring that out, he said slowly, his voice thoughtful. There's still a lot I want to do here. We've come a long way, but there's always room for improvement. Jessica smiled knowingly. You're a builder, Ethan. You see potential in places other people overlook. That's what makes you a great leader. Ethan glanced at her, grateful for her insight. I appreciate that, Jessica. I really do. They shared a quiet moment of understanding before Jessica stepped away to join the others, leaving Ethan to his thoughts. Later that afternoon, as the office began to wind down for the weekend, Ethan found himself thinking about the relationships that had formed since he started at Armstrong. The team had grown closer in ways he hadn't expected, and while much of that was due to the shared experience of overcoming Ryan's toxic leadership, it was also because of the genuine care they had developed for one another. One relationship in particular had deepened over the past few months, his friendship with Kelsey. After the tumultuous weeks of confronting Ryan and working to turn the company around, Ethan and Kelsey had grown into trusted confidants. They shared a similar drive, a similar passion for seeing people succeed. But there was also something else, an unspoken connection that had developed over time. They understood each other in ways that went beyond the professional. As the last of the team members left the office that evening, Ethan found Kelsey sitting in the quiet break room, reviewing some reports for an upcoming meeting. He grabbed a couple of coffees from the counter and made his way over to her table. Thought you could use a break, he said, handing her one of the mugs. Kelsey looked up, smiling as she took the coffee. Thanks. I definitely needed this. Ethan sat across from her, leaning back in his chair as they sipped their drinks in comfortable silence. It was moments like this that reminded him how far they had come, not just as a company, but as people. So, Kelsey said after a few minutes, glancing up from her reports, are you ready for the next big challenge? Ethan chuckled softly. There's always another challenge, isn't there? Kelsey smirked, setting her papers aside. Of course, but I think we're ready for it. We've built a strong foundation. Ethan nodded in agreement. I think so too. This team is different now, stronger. Kelsey's expression softened as she looked at him. And that's because of you, Ethan. You've led by example. You've shown people that they can trust leadership again. Ethan felt a wave of gratitude wash over him, but he kept his tone light. I couldn't have done it without you. You've been my rock through all of this. Kelsey smiled, her eyes glinting with warmth. I think we've made a pretty good team. Ethan met her gaze, and for a moment there was a quiet understanding between them, an acknowledgement of everything they had been through together. The connection they had built wasn't just professional anymore. It was personal. They finished their coffees in silence, but the air between them was filled with unspoken promises of friendship, of support, of something deeper that they both understood but didn't need to say out loud. As the evening wore on, they said their goodbyes, knowing they'd be back on Monday, ready to face whatever new challenges came their way. 6 months later, Armstrong Industries was thriving in ways no one could have imagined. The company had expanded into new markets, launched innovative products, and established itself as a leader in its field. But more importantly, the team was stronger than ever. Under Ethan's leadership, Armstrong had become a place where people wanted to work, a place where they could grow, take risks, and succeed. The culture of fear and intimidation was long gone, replaced by a culture of trust, collaboration, and respect. Ethan stood in his office one afternoon, looking out at the bustling city below. He had come to Armstrong with a mission to root out the toxicity and rebuild the company from the ground up. And now, as he looked at everything they had accomplished, he knew they had succeeded. Jessica knocked on his door, stepping into the office with a smile. Got a minute? Ethan turned to face her, nodding. Of course. What's up? She handed him a document, her eyes shining with excitement. I just got this from the board. They're officially offering you a permanent leadership role, here if you want it. Ethan took the document, scanning it quickly. It was exactly what he had been working toward, a long-term leadership position, with the freedom to continue shaping the company's future. But as he read through the offer, he felt a strange sense of hesitation. He had built something incredible at Armstrong, but he wasn't sure if this was where his journey ended. Jessica seemed to sense his uncertainty. "You don't have to decide right now," she said gently. "Take your time. Whatever you choose, just know that you've made a lasting impact here." Ethan smiled, grateful for her understanding. "Thanks, Jessica. I appreciate that." After she left, Ethan sat down at his desk, thinking about everything that had happened over the past year. Armstrong Industries was in a good place, and he was proud of the work they had done. But deep down, he knew that he was a builder, a leader who thrived on creating change, on helping people reach their potential. As he stared at the document in front of him, Ethan realized that his journey might not end at Armstrong. There were other companies out there, other teams that needed the kind of leadership he could provide. Maybe it was time for a new challenge. But for now, he was content to stay where he was. There was still work to be done, and Armstrong was still his home.
Ethan smiled to himself, feeling a sense of peace.
Whatever the future held, he knew one thing for sure: the legacy he had built at Armstrong would last for years to come. And that was enough. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the end of this story. If you enjoyed this journey and want to hear more stories about leadership, overcoming adversity, or other inspiring narratives, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss another upload. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and feel free to drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the story. Thanks again for watching, and stay tuned for more amazing content coming your way. See you in the next one. She would toddle into the nursery, point at the crib, and babble excitedly, as if sensing the excitement in the air. One evening, as Naomi and Ethan sat on the porch after putting Emma to bed, they talked about the changes that were coming and how much their lives had evolved since they first met. "Do you ever think about where we were just a few years ago?" Naomi asked, her voice thoughtful. "Everything we've been through, everything that's changed. It feels like a lifetime ago." Ethan smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "I think about it all the time, and I wouldn't change a thing." Naomi laughed softly. "Not even the part where I hated you." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Even that. It brought us here, didn't it?" Naomi nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "It did, and I'm so grateful for that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars twinkle above them. Their journey had been anything but smooth, but they had come out stronger because of it. They had built a life filled with love, purpose, and hope for the future. As they looked toward the horizon, they knew that this new chapter, this new life, was just the beginning of something even more beautiful. The day of their second child's birth arrived in a flurry of excitement and nerves. Naomi went into labor early one morning, and after a rushed drive to the hospital, they found themselves in the familiar but still awe-inspiring experience of bringing a new life into the world. Ethan stayed by Naomi's side throughout the entire process, offering her words of encouragement and holding her hand through every contraction. It was an intense and emotional experience, but they faced it together, just as they had with Emma. When their son, Ethan Jr., was born, Naomi and Ethan were overwhelmed with emotion. The moment they held him in their arms, all the challenges, fears, and uncertainties melted away, replaced by an all-encompassing love that filled their hearts. "He's perfect," Naomi whispered, gazing down at their newborn son. Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with tears of joy. Just like his sister, as they held their son, surrounded by the quiet of the hospital room, Naomi and Ethan knew that their family was complete. They had been through so much to get to this point, and now, with two beautiful children and a life filled with purpose, they felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The next few days were filled with visits from family and friends, each one marveling at the newest addition to the family. Emma, still curious about her new brother, gently patted his head and giggled at his tiny hands and feet. Watching their two children together, Naomi and Ethan knew that they had built something beautiful, something that would last for generations. Their love, their commitment to each other, and their dedication to their family had brought them here. and they couldn't wait to see what the future held. With the birth of their second child, Naomi and Ethan entered a new phase of their lives, one filled with the joys and challenges of raising two young children while continuing their work with the foundation and coal enterprises. Though their days were busy and sometimes chaotic, they felt a deep sense of fulfillment in knowing that they were building something lasting, not just for themselves, but for their children and the communities they served. As the years went by, Naomi and Ethan continued to expand the foundation's reach, opening new offices across the country and even internationally. Their mentorship and financial support programs had helped thousands of small businesses thrive, and their commitment to ethical business practices had earned them widespread respect. Their children, Emma and Ethan Jr., grew up surrounded by love and the values their parents had worked so hard to instill in them: integrity, kindness, and a commitment to helping others. Naomi and Ethan made sure to teach them the importance of giving back, often taking them to foundation events and showing them firsthand the impact their work was having on people's lives. One evening, as Naomi and Ethan stood together at a gala celebrating the foundation's 10th anniversary, they took a moment to reflect on everything they had built. The room was filled with people whose lives had been changed by the foundation, and as they looked out over the crowd, they felt a profound sense of pride. "Can you believe it's been 10 years?" Naomi asked, her voice filled with wonder. Ethan smiled, slipping his arm around her waist. "It feels like it's flown by." Naomi nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "Look at all these people, all the lives we've touched. I never imagined we'd be here." Ethan kissed her temple, his heart full. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Naomi turned to him, her expression soft. "We have, and I wouldn't change a thing." As the night went on, they danced together, their love for each other stronger than ever. They had built a legacy that honored Naomi's father, helped countless people, and would live on long after they were gone. And as they swayed to the music, surrounded by the people they had touched and the love they had built, they knew that their journey was far from over. There were still more lives to change, more challenges to face, and more love to give. But for now, they were content in the knowledge that they had created something truly beautiful together. As the night of the gala ended, Naomi and Ethan stood hand in hand, watching the lights dim and the guests slowly leave. The love they had built, the family they cherished, and the legacy they had created with the foundation filled them with an overwhelming sense of pride and peace. They had grown together, turning pain into purpose, and now they were ready for whatever the future held. Ethan smiled, looking at Naomi. "Here's to the next chapter, whatever it may bring." Naomi returned his smile, leaning into him. "As long as we're together, I know we can face anything." With that, they turned toward the future, confident that they had built a life that would continue to make a difference for years to come. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love, redemption, and growth. If this story touched your heart and inspired you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. We love hearing from you, so share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue to explore the power of storytelling together. She had faced them from the very beginning of her fight for Ethan, and now she was facing them on a larger scale. But she remained steadfast in her belief that restorative justice and empathy were the keys to unlocking a child's potential. One particular challenge arose when a major school district in the South resisted the implementation of restorative practices, despite overwhelming evidence of their effectiveness in other districts. The district's board members argued that their community had different values and that the reforms would undermine authority in the classroom. Vanessa traveled to the district to meet with the board members and teachers, determined to convince them of the benefits of change. She shared stories from schools where students had once been labeled as troublemakers but had flourished under the new system. She brought data that showed how suspensions and dropouts had decreased, while academic performance and engagement had improved. "I understand that change is hard," Vanessa said during the meeting, her voice calm but firm. "But if we want our children to succeed, we need to create environments where they feel supported, not afraid." Discipline should be about guidance, not punishment. It's about helping students see that they are more than their mistakes. The debate was intense, but by the end of the meeting, several board members had softened. One of them, Mr. Jameson, a veteran educator who had initially been skeptical, approached Vanessa afterward. "I'll admit, I wasn't sold on this at first, Mr. Jameson said, his tone thoughtful, but you've given me a lot to think about. Maybe we've been too focused on controlling kids and not enough on helping them grow." Vanessa smiled. "That's all I ask, that we take a step back and think about what's best for the kids. It's never too late to change." By the end of the year, the district had begun piloting restorative justice programs in several schools. Vanessa knew it would be a long road, but the progress was undeniable. The conversation was changing, and that was the first step toward lasting reform. As Vanessa's influence continued to grow, she found herself in a new role mentoring young advocates who were inspired by her work. Parents, teachers, and students alike sought her guidance, eager to learn how they could bring about change in their own communities. One of those young advocates was Sophie Adams, a passionate college student studying education and social justice. Sophie had been following Vanessa's work since high school and had reached out, asking if she could intern with Every Child Matters. During their first meeting, Sophie was nervous but excited. "I've been following your work for years, Mrs. Parker," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I want to be part of this movement. I want to help change the system for kids like me, kids who felt like they didn't belong." Vanessa smiled, remembering how she had once felt just as nervous and unsure of her own power. "You're already part of the movement, Sophie. By speaking up, you're making a difference." Under Vanessa's mentorship, Sophie quickly grew into a confident advocate. She traveled with Vanessa to meetings, helped organize events, and even began giving talks of her own. Her energy and passion reminded Vanessa of herself when she first started fighting for Ethan. And it was clear that Sophie had a bright future ahead. During one of their last meetings before Sophie graduated, Vanessa gave her a piece of advice that had guided her throughout her own journey. "Never underestimate the power of your voice," Vanessa said. "Even when it feels like no one is listening, keep speaking up. You never know who's hearing your words and how they might be inspired by them." Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I won't forget that. Thank you, Mrs. Parker. You've changed my life." Vanessa watched as Sophie went on to launch her own advocacy campaign, focused on reforming education policies in underfunded urban schools. It was a reminder that the fight was being carried forward, not just by Vanessa, but by a new generation of leaders. As Every Child Matters gained international recognition, Vanessa began receiving invitations to speak at global conferences on education reform. Countries around the world were struggling with similar issues: outdated disciplinary practices, unequal access to education, and the need for more inclusive teaching methods. One of the most impactful invitations came from the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization UNESCO. They wanted Vanessa to be a keynote speaker at their Global Education Summit, where leaders from over 50 countries would gather to discuss the future of education worldwide. Vanessa felt both honored and overwhelmed. The summit represented the culmination of everything she had worked for, and it was an opportunity to take her message to a global audience. During her speech, Vanessa spoke not just about the changes she had helped bring about in the U.S., but about the universal need for empathy and understanding in education. She emphasized that every child, no matter where they were in the world, deserved to feel valued and supported. "Education is the foundation of our future," Vanessa said, her voice resonating through the large conference hall. "But it's not enough to teach facts and figures. We must teach compassion, resilience, and the belief that every child has something unique to offer. When we create environments that nurture those qualities, we're not just preparing students for school, we're preparing them for life." Her speech was met with a standing ovation, and Vanessa left the summit knowing that her work had now reached a global stage. The fight for educational equity and justice was no longer confined to one country, it was a movement that spanned the globe. Years later, Vanessa found herself back where it all began, at Lincoln Elementary. the school where she had first stood up for Ethan and challenged the system that had failed him. The school had been transformed in the years since, becoming a model for restorative justice and inclusive education. The hallways were filled with laughter and energy, and the students walked with a confidence that was once absent. Vanessa had been invited to the school's annual Student Achievement Day, a celebration of the students' academic and personal growth. As she walked through the halls, she passed by a group of students who were part of a peer mentoring program, a program that had been inspired by Ethan's own work as a mentor years ago. One of the students, Maya, approached Vanessa with a shy smile. "Are you Mrs. Parker? My teacher told us about you. She said you helped make this school what it is today." Vanessa smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I guess you could say that. But it wasn't just me. It was a lot of people working together to make things better." Maya's eyes lit up. "I want to be like you when I grow up. I want to help people." Vanessa knelt down to meet Maya's eyes. "You already are helping, just by being kind and standing up for what's right. Keep doing that, and you'll change the world." As the ceremony began, Vanessa took her seat in the audience, watching as the students were called up to receive their awards. When Ethan's name was announced as a special guest speaker, Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't known he would be speaking. Ethan stood at the podium, looking out at the young faces in the crowd. He spoke about his own journey, how he had once been a scared little boy, isolated and unsure of himself, but how his mother's fight for him had given him the courage to believe in himself. "My mom taught me that we all have the power to make a difference," Ethan said, his voice steady. "No matter how small we feel, no matter how big the challenges seem, we can create change. We can lift each other up, and that's what I want each of you to remember. You matter, and your voice matters." As Ethan finished his speech, Vanessa felt tears in her eyes. It was a full-circle memento reminder of how far they had come and how much they had accomplished together. The world had changed because of their fight, and the future was brighter than ever. As the ceremony ended and the students filed out, Vanessa and Ethan walked together through the halls of Lincoln Elementary, side by side. They had started this journey together, and they would continue it forever, fighting for the belief that every child, everywhere, deserved a chance to shine. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me, always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Mom made hot chocolate. Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. "You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, and I'll never forget that." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.